All right, so we're going to get into our content piece today, and I'm going to start with the scientific revolution. You can see here, I know we've been doing for the last couple of days, is showing you the AP Euro course and exam description. So you're seeing the learning objective on the left. We're going to explain the context in which the scientific revolution developed. And then we're kind of looking at the key concepts on the right and kind of starting to talk about what we're going to do in our actual lesson as we move through into the piece for content. So we're going to contextualize first. We're going to talk about the fact that scientific thought in the early 1500s was based on the ancient world. It was based on the ancient world and times from the Middle Ages. The term science, as we use it today, actually came into being in the 19th century, so well past the topic we're talking about today. One of the most important disciplines was actually natural philosophy, and this focused on questions about the nature of the universe, its purpose, and how the world actually functioned. So European notions about the universe, they were based on Aristotle. So when we're looking at what traditional sources of knowledge are, I know we're definitely talking about the church, but we're going back further to Aristotle and Ptolemy. Medieval theologians like Aquinas brought Aristotle into harmony with Christian doctrine. So they're able to make this come together. And the chief feature of this worldview was the belief in a geocentric model, a motionless, static Earth at the center of the universe. So that's really important because so many of our scientists that we're going to talk about are going to contradict that model. We can move forward.
Right. Getting it. Right. There we go. Here we go.
No problem. So we start with the development of universities. We'll give philosophy a place alongside law and medicine and theology. And these philosophers will acquire independence from the theologians and give them a sense of free inquiry. And then we want to look back at medieval universities drawing on, and this was something that we should have said in the Renaissance, these traditions of Islamic learning. So the Renaissance is part of this because it's happening at the same time, and it's definitely stimulating scientific progress. All right, so again, as we move forward, we're understanding how the natural world changed during the scientific revolution. And so if you can see in the box on the right, we are going to walk through some of the important people that you see there. Whenever we see names in the blue box in the CED, we know that those are must know. So we have new ideas and methods in astronomy led by Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton. So we want to make sure we know who they are. They're going to question the authority of traditional knowledge, and they're going to help to develop a heliocentric view or a sun-centered view of the universe. And then we're not covering everything today, but we're going to skip down to that last historical development. And that one really deals with the scientific method. So Francis Bacon and René Descartes, they define the inductive and deductive reasoning and promote experimentation that will use math and which would ultimately shape the scientific method. So both of them have the scientific method attributed to them. So you can see this image here, and this is an image of the heliocentric view of the universe that Copernicus is advocating. So Copernicus was actually a Polish cleric, and he believed that the stars and planets, including the Earth, revolved around a fixed sun. We call this the heliocentric theory, definitely in the must know. And it was the idea that the sun, rather than the Earth, was at the center of the universe. So his very important work that he publishes in 1543 on the revolution of heavenly spheres or heavenly bodies, you see it sometimes. And the implications of this were really widespread. He contradicts Ptolemy and Aristotle. And he contradicted not only the idea that the Earth was in the center of the universe, but also that heaven and Earth were separate and that there were not crystal spheres, as Aristotle thought, moving around the Earth. So religious leaders were somewhat divided in their reaction to this. Most Catholics actually didn't pay a lot of attention. The Catholic Church had not held to a literal interpretation of the Bible, but his work was declared false in 1616. So Copernicus is our heliocentric person. All right, and then we have Galileo, and you can see the picture there, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. But he also challenges Aristotle's views about motion on Earth. And he devised a law to explain the law of accelerating bodies, and that's 32 feet per second or per second square. He improved a telescope, and he used it to look at the heavens and wrote his very famous work, The Starry Messenger. So it had depictions of the moon as imperfect with craters. So that's not a crystal sphere. So this is going to contradict the idea of perfect heavenly bodies. After publishing it, he was tried by the Inquisition and placed on house arrest. And you can see in the picture, that's a picture of his trial. Then Isaac Newton, one of our other must-knows from the course and exam description. He was born, he's English, he was born into lower English gentry in 1642 and enrolled in Cambridge in 1661. And he united the experimental and theoretical mathematical sides of science. So he arrived at some of his most basic idea about physics between 1664 and 1666 during a break from studies because there's an outbreak of the plague during that time. Something we can all understand these days. In 1687, he published his kind of quintessential work, Principia Mathematica, and he's our synthesizer. He brings together the astronomy of Copernicus, corrects for Kepler, who does elliptical orbits, with the physics of Galileo and his predecessors. He puts forward the 3 laws of motion that many of you have probably learned in school. And a key feature of this synthesis or bringing together was the law of universal gravitation, that every body in the universe attracts every other body in a precise mathematical relationship. So he is our great synthesizer, our person that kind of brings everything together. And so then we come to that last key concept, and this is about the scientific method. You can see the picture there of Sir Francis Bacon. Bacon and Descartes both articulate versions of the scientific method. Bacon argued that new knowledge had to be pursued through empirical research, and he formalized the general theory of inductive reasoning or empiricism. He began with systematic observations and experimentation and generalized from this knowledge. He believed that science should be useful and make people's lives longer and more comfortable, so very practical. In 1660, followers of Bacon created the Royal Society to discuss the findings of scholars from all over Europe. And last but not least,
sorry.
That's okay. Last but not least, you're not driving well today. René Descartes was a brilliant mathematician, and he argued for the deductive approach, one that moved from general principles to more particular cases through steps of reason. And he wrote about this in his work, his Discourse on Method in 1637. He's known for his idea of dualism, Cartesian dualism, the idea that nature is made up of both a tangible substance that takes up the space we call matter and an intangible substance that is the mind. He also is famous for Cartesian geography or Cartesian planes that we use as the coordinate system, and that's useful for architecture and engineering. So these are our kind of must-know scientists. I'm sure it's possible that your teacher covered other ones, but we were trying to give you just a quick little reminder from the scientific revolution, along with evidence. So when you see the writings that we've talked about, those are pieces of evidence that you could use for an SAQ or for an LEQ, and just make sure that you're thinking about that. All right, thanks, Todd.
Really nice job unpacking those essentials. So now we move from scientific revolution and we move into an era known as Enlightenment. Okay, and so we're going to take a look at this image. One of the great enlightened thinkers was John Locke. So the scientific revolution contributed to a series of debates in the 18th century, the 1700s, known as the Enlightenment, where intellectuals began to apply many of the principles of the scientific revolution to society and human institutions. So these great thinkers take what the scientists have taught them, and they're trying to say, can we apply that to a social context and make life better? In the 17th century, the groundwork for the Enlightenment was laid by individuals such as John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, who both had philosophies based on natural law, science, and ideas regarding a social contract. Hobbes was negative about the nature of man and believed that humans would compete violently for power and the wealth if left to themselves. He wrote about this in his work Leviathan, and Leviathan's like a mythical creature or sea monster. And he outlines a social contract in which all members of a society were ruled by an absolute monarch, and that it is the role of the monarch then to maintain peace and order. So he very much advocates for absolutism in order to keep society safe. Locke disagreed with Hobbes and Hobbes's negative view of man, believing instead that man is basically rational and that man's natural rights of life, liberty, equality, and property come prior to the development of society. He writes in his second treatise on government, he explains the social contract he believes in, one in which the government should provide order and arbitrate disputes, but one that can be removed if it becomes abusive to those natural rights. In other words, if the government becomes abusive, then it should be removed. Locke also wrote in the Essay Concerning Human Understanding, he wrote that in 1690, in which he argued that the humans learn from experience and are born tabula rasa, that probably should be in italics because it is Latin, or a blank slate, rather than born with innate ideas. So you think about this, are you born with a blank slate, or are there some things that are already pre-coded, if you will? So we're going to start with this image of, we continue our learning about the Enlightenment. We're going to talk about Diderot, who did the famous encyclopedia. And so I found, there's lots of images about the encyclopedia. And so choosing was difficult, but I thought bookbinding was kind of apropos, if you will, for the Enlightenment and scholarly study. So we're going to talk about the philosophes. They're a group of intellectuals in France who claimed they were bringing the light of reason to their fellow human beings. Although France, particularly Paris, was at the center of the Enlightenment, and the philosophes wanted to reach a larger audience of elites. But the center of the Enlightenment thought is definitely in Paris. Montesquieu wrote his most important work, The Spirit of Laws, 1748. Here he expresses his favor for governments such as in Britain that has a separation of powers and has a system of checks and balances on major political interess so that there's less likely to be great abuses of power. Voltaire, I'm sure you guys probably have read and talked about Voltaire. He's probably the most famous of the philosophes, very sarcastic, and this commitment to intellectual freedom created both admiration and a lot of resentment. He was a fierce proponent for religious toleration, shown in his famous cry, "Crush the infamous thing," which he's talking about as far as dogma. Religious dogma is something that is fixed, okay? Then there is Denis Diderot. He was one of the editors of the encyclopedia, 17-volume work that quite ambitiously tried to alphabetically arrange all of human knowledge. And so it was quite an undertaking, but what's amazing about the encyclopedia, these are huge volumes. So it's not like a small book on a shelf. The actual size of each book is really, really large, and they have all these amazing engravings from it. Then finally, we'll talk about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, gained a significant renown later in the Enlightenment. He glorified the idea of the noble savage, exemplified by American Indians who used instinct and emotion rather than reason. So he is kind of, he's kind of the contrary argument, right? You've got all about reason and knowledge, and he's saying, shouldn't our instinct and shouldn't these innate aspects of emotion be also something that we're relying on? He writes The Social Contract, in which he argued that the general will needed to be realized through pursuing the common good. What is best for the common good? Women and the Enlightenment. You see this nice image of Mary Wollstonecraft. Salons, particularly in Paris, this is where it kind of disseminated what Enlightenment culture would be. And the women who ran them attracted speakers to stimulate conversation on a wide variety of topics such as philosophy and politics. It's really a way for women to be influential in the Enlightenment, and they have a lot of power because they are the ones doing the inviting about who is going to come together and what kind of thought will come out of that evening's event. Madame de Giaffren ran one of the most famous of these salons, hosted intellectuals. She acted as patroness. And despite the principles of equality espoused by the Enlightenment, Rousseau offered controversial arguments for the exclusion of women from political life. He argues men and women were radically different by nature. Therefore, according to Rousseau, should play roles in life limited to women, should play roles in life limited to the domestic sphere, and men should be in the political sphere, according to Rousseau. In response to this, Ms. Wollstonecraft has some arguments for him. She rejects Rousseau's view and writes thoughts on the education of daughters. Later during the French Revolution, she writes a vindication of the rights of women, arguing that only physical strength actually separates the sexes, and it was in inequity in educational opportunities that is the real difference in these sexes, and that women are being discriminated against and not given the chance at education as men are getting. And then finally, we'll talk about just quickly the international Enlightenment. We see this image of Adam Smith, the Scot. Outside of France, there are many strains of Enlightenment. There's Protestant Enlightenment, Catholic Enlightenment, Jewish Enlightenment, all sought to reconcile reason and faith. So some of these Enlightenment thinkers are from the Scottish Enlightenment in particular: David Hume, John Locke, Adam Smith. Hume emphasizes civic morality and religious skepticism, a healthy religious skepticism. Adam Smith's most famous work is The Wealth of Nations. He argues against laws and regulations that prevent commerce from reaching its full capacity. He says he advocates for laissez-faire economics, or the invisible hand, and he argues against this idea of mercantilist type government that we talked about in the absolutist monarchs yesterday. There is the American Enlightenment. It's heavily influenced by Locke and Montesquieu. All you need to do is kind of look at some of our founding documents and you can see their work and their influences there. John Locke, thinking about social contract, Montesquieu's arguments for checks and balances and separation of government, heavily influenced Americans such as Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson. And then after 1760, Enlightenment ideas were debated in German-speaking states, often with Christian theology. One of those is Immanuel Kant, a professor in East Prussia. He published the pamphlet, What is Enlightenment? He answered with Dare to Know. And then Kant constructed incorrect ideas, unfortunately, about race that had long-lasting consequences that other thinkers also took in or believed as well. All right.